What if the story of Britain and Ireland's DNA was never just a story of kings, warriors, and invasions, but a story carried just as much by women whose names were never recorded? Not because they were less important, but because history was never written to look for them. When people trace the ancestry of the English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish, the story usually moves in straight lines, migration after migration, invasion after invasion. Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans. A map filled with movements of men, armies, and borders. But that version of history is missing something fundamental, because none of those populations became permanent without women, not as a side detail, but as the mechanism that turned movement into survival. Children had to be born, raised, fed, protected, and integrated into new landscapes, languages, and communities. Without that process, there's no continuity, only passing movement. So, if we are asking how the people of these islands actually formed, we have to shift the focus away from only who arrived and toward who stayed. Who built households? Who held families together through collapse, famine, conflict, and change? Because that is where population history actually happens. Not only on battlefields, but inside homes. And before there were English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish identities at all, there were women already doing the work of continuity, before history had names. To understand this, we have to go back to the end of the last ice age. As the ice sheets retreated, small groups of hunter-gatherers moved into the land that would later become Britain and Ireland. These were not nations, nor tribes in the later sense, but small, mobile communities following seasons, animals, rivers, and coastlines. The archaeological record shows their tools and camps, while genetics reveals that some of their ancestry still survives today. Yet neither tells us what daily life actually felt like. For that, we have to reason carefully. Survival in these conditions was never individual. It was collective. Children could not survive alone. Food had to be processed and shared. Shelter had to be maintained. Knowledge had to be passed from one generation to the next without written language. At the center of all of that was care work, much of it carried by women, not as an abstract idea, but as daily physical survival. Feeding, caring, preparing, teaching, and holding communities together through environments that were constantly changing. Long before there were any recognizable peoples of Britain and Ireland, there were already patterns of life that depended on continuity, and continuity depends on women. The first transformation? Farming. Then came one of the most important turning points in human history, the arrival of farming. Over time, farming communities spread into Britain and Ireland from populations ultimately rooted in earlier agricultural societies in continental Europe. Ancient DNA shows that this was not just a cultural shift, but also a biological one. New populations became a major part of the ancestry of the islands. Yet farming did far more than change the food people ate. It transformed life itself. Settlements became more permanent. Land became more central. Property and inheritance became more structured. Daily life became increasingly tied to place. In these societies, the demands placed upon households increased dramatically. Food processing, textile production, animal care, storage, and repeated childbirth all became essential to survival. We should be careful not to project modern assumptions onto the past, but across early farming societies, one pattern appears consistently. The household became the core unit of survival, and within that household, women carried a large share of the continuous labor that kept life stable. Not occasionally, but constantly. This is not the dramatic history of monuments and conquest. It is the slower history of reproduction and maintenance, the kind of history that is rarely recorded but without which nothing else could endure. Monuments above, families below. Neolithic Britain and Ireland left behind some of the most striking monuments in Europe. Stone circles, burial chambers, and ceremonial landscapes built over generations still dominate how we imagine prehistory. Yet these structures were never separate from everyday life. They were the visible surface of deeper social systems, systems built on families, on kinship, on obligations passed across generations, and on the quiet continuity of household life. Here again, women are central even when they remain invisible. Every community capable of building over generations depends on those raising the next generation, maintaining the rhythm of daily survival while larger social and ritual structures rise above them. We cannot name most of these women, but we can say something important with confidence. These monuments were not built by ritual specialists alone or by political leaders alone. They were sustained by entire communities, and communities only endure through reproduction, care, and continuity. The first great genetic shift. Thousands of years later, another major transformation reshaped Britain and Ireland. The Bronze Age. Ancient DNA reveals one of the most significant ancestry shifts in British history during this period. Populations associated with new cultural horizons and steppe-related ancestry became a major component of the genetic landscape. In some places, earlier Neolithic lineages were largely replaced. In others, they were absorbed into emerging populations. The result was not a simple story of replacement, but a profound restructuring of population across the islands. What matters here is not reducing this change to a single explanation, because we still do not know every mechanism involved. Migration, intermarriage, social dominance, and local integration all likely played important roles. Yet, from the perspective of continuity, one fact stands above the rest. No population change becomes permanent unless families form, unless children are raised, and unless communities reproduce themselves across generations. That process always depends on women, not as passive participants, but as central figures, determining whether demographic change becomes lasting history. Movement alone does not create a people. Only continuity does. A subtle but important pattern emerges. As we move into later prehistoric Britain, a more complex picture begins to emerge. In some regions, evidence suggests remarkably strong patterns of local continuity. In others, movement and change appear much more pronounced. Increasingly, researchers have suggested that women may have played an especially important role in maintaining local stability, not necessarily as rulers or political leaders, but as anchors of kinship networks, people who remained rooted in place more often than men in certain contexts, while men moved through marriage, alliance, trade, or conflict. This was not a universal rule, nor did it apply equally across every region or every period. Even so, it introduces an important idea. Continuity may not always have been centered on the most visible figures in history. It may instead have been shaped quietly through the structure of family life itself. That possibility transforms how we understand ancestry, because ancestry is not simply about movement. It is about what remains stable while everything else changes. The real question. At this point, a different question begins to emerge. Not simply who invaded or who migrated, but how populations actually held together through centuries of change. How does identity persist when languages shift? When elites rise and fall? When borders move? When entire cultures transform? The answer is rarely found in politics alone. It is found inside households, in marriage patterns, in child rearing, in kinship networks stretching across generations, and in the women who carried those systems forward, quietly, continuously, and often without ever being named, when identity starts to shift. By the time we reach the Iron Age, Britain and Ireland are no longer distant prehistoric landscapes. They are populated, structured, and culturally complex societies. Hill forts rise across the landscape, trade networks expand, and regional identities become increasingly visible. For the first time, we begin to approach something closer to the world that later historical sources would recognize. Yet even here, the way we tell the story can be misleading. Iron Age Britain is often described in terms of tribes, chiefs, and warriors, but beneath those visible structures lies something far more stable, the everyday organization of family life. While political alliances shifted and conflicts reshaped territories, the continuity of society rested within households where generations were raised, traditions were preserved, and communities endured. It is here, rather than on battlefields or in tribal rivalries, that the deepest foundations of ancestry can be found. A different pattern begins to emerge. Recent ancient DNA studies have revealed something subtle but significant in parts of Iron Age Britain. In certain regions, women appear to have been more locally rooted than men, a pattern that anthropologists describe as a matrilocal tendency. In these communities, women often remained closer to their birthplace, while men moved more frequently through marriage, alliance, or other social arrangements. This does not mean Iron Age Britain was matriarchal, nor does it suggest that women ruled society, and it certainly was not true everywhere. Nevertheless, it offers an important insight into how communities functioned. If women remained more closely connected to the same landscapes across generations, they became the living bridge between past and future, preserving local continuity through family life rather than political authority. Their influence was not expressed through kingship or conquest, but through the quiet stability of kinship networks that allowed communities to endure despite constant social change. The Celtic Question, revisited, Few subjects in the history of Britain and Ireland have generated more debate than the origins of the so-called Celtic world. For generations, the popular narrative imagined waves of Celtic peoples sweeping across Europe into the British Isles, replacing earlier populations and establishing a shared cultural identity. Modern scholarship, however, paints a far more complex picture. Languages do not always spread through mass migration. They can also expand through elite influence, trade, social interaction, and gradual cultural adoption. Most importantly, they spread within households. Every language is first learned as a child, long before it is spoken in assemblies or on battlefields. Although we can never know precisely how Iron Age mothers spoke to their children, we can say with confidence that if Celtic languages spread gradually across generations, then family life must have played a central role. In that sense, women stood at the heart of one of history's most powerful transformations, not merely preserving culture, but transmitting identity itself from one generation to the next. Rome enters the story. Then came Rome, an empire whose influence stretched across continents and eventually reached Britain through conquest, administration, commerce, and military occupation. In southern Britain, Roman rule reshaped society. Towns expanded, roads connected distant regions, military forts were established, and people from across the empire passed through or settled within the province. Yet this transformation was never uniform. Roman authority remained weaker and more temporary in the north, where local societies retained greater independence. The significance of Rome lies not in suggesting a complete genetic replacement, but in understanding how it transformed patterns of interaction. New trade routes encouraged mobility, marriages crossed cultural boundaries, and communities absorbed fresh influences while preserving older traditions. Roman Britain was not a clean break with the past. Instead, it became another layer added to an already complex population history. As before, these changes only became permanent when they entered family life, where households adapted to new realities and passed them on to future generations. The reality of disruption. It is also important to recognize a less comfortable aspect of this history. Not every movement of people in Britain and Ireland happened by choice. Throughout the early medieval period, especially around the Irish Sea, historical evidence records episodes of raiding, captivity, and forced migration. Women and children could be taken from their communities, transported across regions, and incorporated into new societies under conditions of coercion rather than consent. This was not the primary explanation for population change across Britain and Ireland as a whole, but it remains an undeniable part of the historical record. It reminds us that ancestry is shaped not only by peaceful migration and marriage, but also by violence, displacement, and survival. Even in these difficult circumstances, new families formed, new generations were born, and continuity persisted. Human history is often advanced through hardship as much as stability, and the resilience of ordinary families ensured that communities endured despite repeated disruption. The Viking layer. Beginning in the late 8th century, another major layer was added to the genetic and cultural history of Britain and Ireland with the arrival of the Norse. Viking activity first appeared as raids on monasteries and coastal settlements, but over time it developed into permanent settlement across many regions, particularly in northern and western Britain and throughout parts of Ireland. Modern genetics has helped overturn the traditional image of Viking expansion as an exclusively male phenomenon. In places such as the Northern Isles, evidence indicates that entire families, including women and children, settled together rather than consisting solely of raiding parties. This distinction is important because it transforms our understanding of cultural change. In many places, Norse communities did not simply conquer existing populations. They married locally, blended traditions, and established households that combined different cultural backgrounds. Identity evolved gradually through family life, where children inherited languages, customs, and ancestry from both sides. Once again, lasting historical change emerged not simply from conquest, but from the formation of communities rooted in everyday domestic life. Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland are not uniform. One of the clearest lessons emerging from modern genetic research is that Britain and Ireland have never shared a single uniform ancestry. Instead, each region tells its own story. Some areas preserve remarkably deep layers of local ancestry stretching back thousands of years, while others reveal repeated episodes of migration and genetic mixing. Island communities often follow different paths from inland populations, and northern and western regions frequently retain distinct genetic signatures when compared with southern and eastern Britain. This diversity reminds us that there is no single genetic history of Britain or Ireland. Rather, there are many overlapping regional histories, each shaped by its own combinations of continuity, migration, adaptation, and local resilience. These histories were sustained through ordinary communities, through marriage networks, inheritance, family relationships, and the everyday decisions that connected one generation to the next. The quiet structure beneath everything. By now, a consistent pattern begins to emerge. Across every major transformation in the history of Britain and Ireland, from the first hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age to the arrival of farming, the sweeping changes of the Bronze Age, the development of Iron Age societies, Roman occupation, and Viking settlement, the visible story is always one of movement, conflict, expansion, or political change. Yet beneath every one of those events lies a quieter and far more enduring structure, continuity. That continuity depended on households, on kinship, on child-rearing, on care work, and on the countless women whose daily labor sustained communities across generations. Their role was never merely symbolic. They were both the biological and social foundation upon which every lasting population was built. Maps may record the movements of armies and the rise of kingdoms, but history only becomes permanent when change enters the home, when families adapt, and when each new generation carries that inheritance into the future, when history becomes modern. By the time we enter the early medieval world, the outlines of modern Britain and Ireland begin to emerge. Kingdoms rise and fall, languages evolve, borders are drawn and redrawn, and written history becomes increasingly common. For the first time, people leave behind records that describe rulers, battles, and political events in their own words. Yet beneath these chronicles, the deeper structure of population history remains remarkably unchanged. The evidence becomes more visible, but the mechanism behind it does not. Beneath kingdoms, monasteries, and royal dynasties, the same quiet system continues to shape society. Households remain the foundation of everyday life. Families continue to connect one generation to the next, and it is through this long continuity of ordinary lives, rather than the actions of kings alone, that the populations of Britain and Ireland are carried into the modern age, the Pictish and Gaelic worlds. Across northern Britain, Pictish societies and later Gaelic-speaking communities developed distinctive cultural identities that would leave a lasting mark on history. Earlier interpretations often treated these peoples as isolated or even biologically separate populations. Modern genetic research tells a more nuanced story. Rather than revealing deep divisions, it points to substantial continuity across the region, with shared ancestry often outweighing biological separation. Many of the differences that appear in historical sources were cultural, linguistic, and political, rather than the result of entirely distinct populations replacing one another. Identity, therefore, was something built upon existing communities rather than something that erased them. As in every earlier period, that identity was passed from one generation to the next inside the household, through language, upbringing, shared customs, and everyday family life. The foundations of culture were laid not only in royal courts or tribal assemblies, but around hearths where children learned how to speak, behave, and understand the world. The surname illusion. As Britain and Ireland move into the medieval and early modern periods, another source of misunderstanding begins to shape how people think about ancestry. Surnames. Family names appear to offer a direct line into the past, creating the impression that they reveal where a person's ancestry truly comes from. In reality, they tell only part of the story. Most surnames became established through paternal inheritance, preserving a single branch of ancestry, while leaving countless others hidden from view. Maternal lines, collateral relatives, and generations of regional mixing often disappear behind one inherited family name. Surnames remain valuable historical clues, but they are fragments rather than complete genetic maps. This is especially significant when considering women's history, because much of their contribution to ancestry was never preserved within naming systems at all. Even though they shaped population history continuously across generations, written records often leave their stories incomplete. What DNA actually shows. Modern ancient DNA research has transformed our understanding of the deep history of Britain and Ireland. Its greatest contribution has not been to simplify the past, but to reveal how extraordinarily layered it truly is. Instead of uncovering single origins, researchers have found repeated waves of migration, interaction, and genetic mixing. Instead of clear-cut replacements, they see patterns of absorption, adaptation, and long-term continuity. Instead of one uniform population, They find remarkable regional diversity that reflects thousands of years of local history. Yet DNA alone cannot explain how these changing populations became stable societies. Genes may move relatively quickly through migration, but lasting communities are created through social structures. Those structures exist within families, where children are raised, identities are formed, and traditions are preserved. In the end, genetics points us back toward the same conclusion reached throughout this story. Biological change becomes lasting history only when it is sustained by human relationships. The bridge between change and continuity. Looking across every major transformation in the history of Britain and Ireland, a remarkably consistent pattern emerges. Movement occurs through migration, trade, conflict, conquest, and cultural exchange. Yet movement by itself never creates a lasting population. It must pass through a stabilizing system before it becomes permanent. That system is the family. Within it, women played a central role, not as a romanticized correction to traditional history, nor as symbolic figures added to an existing narrative, but as the lived mechanism through which continuity became possible. Through childbirth, caregiving, household labor, kinship networks, adaptation during times of disruption, and the countless responsibilities that sustain daily life, they connected one generation to the next. This history has never truly been hidden because it was secret. It has been hidden because traditional historical writing rarely placed its focus on the ordinary work that allowed societies to survive. A different way of seeing ancestry. When people think about ancestry today, they often imagine percentages, ethnic origins, or simplified categories of identity. Yet the true story is far more complex. Ancestry is not a fixed inheritance passed unchanged through time. It is a process built over thousands of years through repeated cycles of migration, settlement, adaptation, and survival. Those cycles were stabilized not by abstract populations, but by real families living ordinary lives. Within those relationships, women frequently made continuity possible during periods of extraordinary instability. Their contributions were not always recorded by chroniclers, but they were preserved in something even more enduring: the survival of communities themselves. Without continuity at the household level, no population, no culture, and no genetic legacy could endure across generations. The final picture. So who were the women behind the DNA of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland? They were never a single people, nor were they defined by one role. They were hunter-gatherers adapting to the changing landscapes left behind by the Ice Age. They were early farmers establishing permanent settlements and reshaping daily life. They were Bronze Age women living through one of the greatest population transformations in British history. They were members of Iron Age communities rooted within regional kinship networks. They lived in Roman Britain, navigating expanding economies, new cultures, and greater mobility. They shaped the languages and identities of early medieval societies. Some experienced migration through marriage, while others endured displacement or coercion during periods of conflict. Still others became part of Norse communities where different traditions blended across generations. Most of their names have disappeared from history, but they are not absent from it. Their lives remain present within the populations that exist today, not as a story of pure origins, but as a continuous accumulation of human experience layered across thousands of years. Closing reflection. If there is one idea to carry away from this journey, it is this: the history of Britain and Ireland was never shaped only by those who crossed seas, marched with armies, or redrew maps. It was also shaped by those who transformed movement into continuity, who turned disruption into family, and who ensured that each generation inherited not only DNA, but language, culture, memory, and belonging. That work was rarely celebrated by chroniclers and seldom recorded in official histories, yet it never stopped. Quietly, consistently, and across thousands of years, women stood at the center of the processes that allowed populations to endure. Their names may have faded, but their legacy remains everywhere. In the genetic heritage of the present, in the regional identities that still define Britain and Ireland, and in the simple truth that every one of us exists because countless generations before us chose, against every challenge, to keep life moving forward.